Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that, well, might seem a bit unassuming at first glance. The fear of mice and rats.
hmm
You, our listener, sent in some really fascinating materials that honestly opened our eyes to just how widespread this is and how culturally significant.
It's quite something.
So, our mission today is to explore this common fear. We want to, figure out where the facts end and maybe the folklore begins.
Yeah, and understand why these little creatures can trigger such, well, intense reactions in so many people.
Exactly.
And, just to start, it helps to have the right words. There are actually a few terms for this specific fear.
Oh, yeah.
There's musophobia, that comes from the Greek for mouse.
Hmm?
Then murophobia, that's from Latin for mouse or rat, kind of reflect the whole taxonomic group.
Okay.
And even saurophobia, which has French origins from their word for mouse.
Wow. Okay.
Huh.
So lots of ways to say it. But one of the first things that really stood out in the sources you sent was this crucial difference between a real phobia, like an intense, irrational fear, and just a normal, healthy concern about rodents.
Exactly. We're not talking about the understandable worry about, mice getting into your pantry.
Right. That seems pretty universal, historically speaking, protecting food supplies.
Precisely. That caution is tied to very real risks,
Hmm.
disease, contamination, that sort of thing. A phobia, though, that's different. It's an irrational, often overwhelming fear.
And what's interesting based on the materials is the idea that for many people, this intense reaction might not actually be some deep-seated psychological disorder, right?
Well, not always, no. It seems in many cases it might be more like a learned response, a socially induced conditioned response almost.
So picked up from others, or maybe from a bad experience, like that sudden jump you do if a mouse, darts out unexpectedly.
That's a big part of it. That initial startle response, which is natural, by the way, lots of animals have it, that can sometimes get amplified.
Right, sort of snowballs.
Yeah, that basic startle reflex is key. But like we see with other specific phobias, that initial fright can, unfortunately for some people, escalate
Escalate how?
into a level of anxiety that's genuinely disruptive,
Yeah.
something that might actually need professional help.
Okay, which brings us to treatment then. How do you address that kind of intense fear? The materials mentioned standard approaches for specific phobias. Systematic desensitization came up.
That's a very common one,
Can
yes.
you sort of walk us through how that generally works for anyone not familiar?
Sure. Systematic desensitization basically involves gradually exposing the person to the thing they fear. But, and this is key, in a controlled, safe way.
Like baby steps.
Exactly. Think of it like getting into cold water. You probably wouldn't just jump into a freezing lake, right?
Definitely not.
You'd test it, maybe dip your toes, wade in slowly. It's similar here. The exposure can happen in a therapist's office, sometimes using imagination or even hypnosis, sometimes a
The
mix,
goal being.
to weaken that link between the trigger, the mouse, in this case, and the anxiety response.
Hmm.
Over time, it becomes less frightening.
That makes a lot of sense. And one of the sources pointed a really interesting angle on this, actively trying to build positive associations with mice.
Yes, that's a fascinating element. So it's not just about reducing the fear.
You're actually trying to link the idea of a mouse with something pleasant, like positive reinforcement.
Precisely. It's proactive. Instead of just chipping away at the negative, you're trying to actively build a new positive connection in the brain, kind of retraining that response.
Hmm. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We have to talk about the elephant in the room. Literally.
Ah, yes. The classic.
The idea that elephants are terrified of mice, it's such an enduring image, isn't it? In cartoons and just general folklore.
It's incredibly persistent. The information you provided points way back, possibly to Pliny the Elder's Naturalis Historia.
Pliny the Elder, wow.
Yeah, he apparently wrote that elephants cannot abide a mouse or a rat. So the idea's been around for a very long time.
But then, fast forward, and the sources also mention, zoos and animal experts.
Right, showing that elephants can actually be conditioned not to react. They can get used to mice being around.
So maybe science kind of debunks the old myth.
Well, maybe not entirely, because the Mythbusters experiment you mentioned adds a twist.
Oh yeah, what did they find?
They observed that elephants did seem to try and avoid a mouse placed near them.
Really? So maybe there's something to it.
It suggests there might be a basis for a reaction, yeah.
Oh,
Maybe not full-blown terror like the cartoon show, but perhaps more of that startle response again to sudden, unexpected movement near their feet.
right. Okay, more of a, whoa, what was that? Then, oh, a mouse.
Could be.
Hmm.
And we should probably also mention that rather graphic folk tale that one source talked about.
The one about rats crawling into elephants' ears?
Yeah, to gnaw on their brains.
Ooh,
Pretty gruesome.
yikes. And the source said it even showed up in a rule book somewhere. Just shows how these wild stories can spread.
It definitely paints a picture. Okay, moving from uh, legendary animal fears to something more historical. The materials introduced Gertrude of Nivelle.
Ah, yes. Tell us about her. What's her connection to all this?
Well, Gertrude of Nivelles is actually known as the patron saint people would invoke against Musophobia,
The patron saint for fear of mice and rats.
and just against rats and mice in general, yeah. So if you were really troubled by them or the fear of them back in the day, she was the one you prayed to.
That adds such an interesting historical, almost cultural layer. It wasn't just seen as a psychological quirk then.
Clearly not. It shows this fear was recognized and addressed for a long time, even finding a place in religious practice.
Okay. Now let's talk about how this fear often gets shown in media, particularly around gender stereotypes.
Ah, yes, the classic image.
Totally. The woman screaming, jumping up on a chair or a table.
Yeah.
You see it in old movies, cartoons.
Right. And the sources you shared directly address this stereotype. They point out how this often exaggerated fear of mice and rats became a kind of shorthand for stereotypical femininity in pop culture.
But it's crucial to say, as the sources did, that murophobia itself isn't gender specific, right?
Absolutely not. It's
Yeah.
always been experienced by individuals of all sexes.
Mhm.
However, there is a statistic mentioned
What's that?
that women are, statistically speaking, about twice as likely as men to suffer from specific phobias in general, and that includes things like musophobia.
Ah, okay. So the reality is maybe more nuanced than the single stereotype suggests. The stereotype exists, but the underlying rates show some difference.
Exactly. The portrayal in media is often simplistic, but the actual experience is more complex.
And speaking of media, wow, this fear is everywhere in popular culture. The information you provided just lists example after example.
It really is remarkable how often it pops up.
Let's touch on a few. We've got Winston Smith in Orwell's 1984. His fear of rats isn't just a character trait, it's weaponized.
Oh, absolutely. Room 101. It's a truly chilling example of how a deep, visceral fear can be exploited for psychological torture. Really hits hard.
Yeah. Then on a completely different note, you have comedy. Like Frank Costanza in Seinfeld.
Ah, yes. Threatening to move out because of mice. Get rid of the mouse.
And Kramer seemed pretty scared too in that episode. It's played for laughs, but it works because, well, people recognize that underlying fear.
Totally. Comedy often taps into those relatable anxieties, even if it exaggerates them. The fact they chose that fear says something about how common it feels.
And Indiana Jones, or rather his father, Henry John Sr. in The Last Crusade.
I am scared to death of rats, Junior.
Even the most intrepid characters or their families have their Achilles heel, it seems.
It humanizes them, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Shows that even these larger-than-life figures have relatable fears, makes them feel more real.
Yeah, we even see it in kids' stuff, like Doraemon, the robot cat.
Afraid of mice because one bit off his robotic ears, as shown in his origin story movie.
Right, and Princess Zelda in one of the games, Spirit Tracks, she literally freezes solid when she sees rats.
It just crosses all genres and age groups.
Seriously, from intense dystopian fiction to kids' animation. Oh, and Madame Medusa in Disney's The Rescuers.
That's a great one. Terrified of mice.
But keeps two giant pet crocodiles.
The irony is fantastic. Utterly fearless, phasing down huge reptiles, but panics at the sight of Bernard and Bianca.
It really highlights the irrational nature of a phobia, doesn't it? And the list just keeps going.
Yeah.
You mentioned Totally Spies, Rory the racing car.
Tin Top, yeah. Even Ellie the elephant in Donkey Kong Country 3.
Yeah.
Her fear is actually a game mechanic.
And Lofty, the crane from Bob the Builder. He was initially really scared of mice, right? That specific reaction.
Yeah, he apparently hid behind Bob. Though, interestingly, the sources note that later productions seem to remove that fear.
Huh. Wonder why. Maybe they thought it was too stereotypical.
Could be. Or maybe they just wanted to evolve the character. Then there's Bentley in Tom and Jerry, Cowboy Up, Injun Joe in an anime version of Huck Finn.
And even Paw Patrol. Leo, one of the Cat Pack members, starts off scared of mice but learns to overcome it.
Which is a nice little arc, actually. A narrative about managing fear aimed at kids.
So, wrapping this all up, this deep dive into the fear of mice and rats, it's clear it's way more than just a simple dislike.
Absolutely.
We've looked at, the difference between that rational concern and a true phobia, how social learning might play a part.
The treatments, Like desensitization,
That whole long-running elephant and mouse connection.
the patron saint, Gertrude,
How it gets portrayed sometimes stereotypically in media versus the more complex reality.
and just the sheer number of examples in stories, films, games. It's kind of amazing.
It really is. This seemingly, I don't know, small fear has this incredibly rich and complicated history and cultural presence.
It certainly does. It keeps resonating.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. Thinking about just how often this particular fear, mice and rats, pops up in our stories across all kinds of media. What might that tell us?
Yeah, what could it suggest about our own anxieties? Maybe the things that unexpectedly trigger us.
Why do you think this specific fear has become such an enduring theme in our collective storytelling? Something to chew on.
Definitely something to think about.
Thanks for exploring the depths with us today.